For this video, we're going to go over each of the organ systems in a general overview. So it's going to be just short overviews for each of the organ systems, nothing too complex, but we're going to go over the 11 organ systems. So an organ system, right, is just a group of organs that are functioning together. Once again, there are 11. There's the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, the endocrine system, the integumentary system, the lymphatic system, the muscular, nervous, respiratory, skeletal, urinary, and reproductive systems. And so we're going to go over each of these separately. Starting with the cardiovascular system, it's also known as the circulatory system. This system circulates blood and lymph through the body, and what in essence it's doing is transporting oxygen to cells. And in those cells are the mitochondria, where cellular respiration takes place. The importance of oxygen, right, is to be that final electron acceptor during cellular respiration for the production of energy. Parts of the cardiovascular system consist of the heart, blood vessels, erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, and lymph. There are two circulatory loops in the cardiovascular system. There is the pulmonary circuit. This is the heart pumping blood to the lungs, where those blood cells become oxygenated. The deoxygenated blood from the upper half and lower half of the body is received on the right side of the heart. Oxygenated blood returns to the heart on the left side, and it is the atria and the ventricles that are the pumping chambers for the blood through the heart. The systemic circuit is what is transporting the oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, and it is hemoglobin, that is a protein in those red blood cells, or the erythrocytes, that is attaching and transporting that oxygen. Just some other information in regards to the cardiovascular system. Your blood vessels are lined with simple squamous epithelium. It's also known as the endothelium, and that is keeping blood inside the vessels. You have to create a certain pressure to maintain a concentration gradient, right? There are three types of blood vessels. There are arteries that carry blood away from the heart. Arterioles are just narrow arteries that carry blood towards capillaries. Veins carry blood towards the heart, and venules are just narrow veins that are receiving blood from those capillaries and connecting to the veins. Capillaries are the smallest and thinnest blood vessel. And so all of these are meant to maintain concentration gradients of blood throughout your body as blood is being transported to different bodily tissues. The second system is the digestive system, which is a very important system that converts food into energy. And so it's involved in energy assimilation and nutrients for the body. It's also known as the gastrointestinal tract, and it's basically just from mouth to anus, that entire system of digesting the food. So we're going to go over the digestive process. It begins at the mouth, and the mouth is the location of both chemical and mechanical digestion. First of all, the mechanical digestion is just mastication, or the act of chewing to form a bolus. The chemical digestion involves salivary amylase, which digests carbohydrates. So carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth. Once a bolus has been formed, the food enters the esophagus, and through muscle contractions called peristalsis, the food is moved from the esophagus to the stomach. That bolus then enters the stomach through what's called the esophageal sphincter. In the stomach is what's called gastric juice that's composed of hydrochloric acid, potassium chloride, and sodium chloride, so it's very acidic. But there are also bicarbonate ions that sort of buffer against the acidity. And when the food is in your stomach being digested by this gastric juice, it then becomes what is called chyme. Something important to note is that there's no amylase in the stomach, and so carbohydrates are not being digested in the stomach. In the small intestine, food is going to enter through the pyloric sphincter. Food then moves through the small intestine via peristalsis again. There are three portions to the small intestine. There's the duodenum, which is the first portion of the small intestine that's receiving chyme. from the stomach, and it's also receiving pancreatic enzymes through the pancreatic duct from the pancreas, and it's receiving bile through the common bile duct. And so what's happening here is protein digestion and lipid digestion, because bile is in essence an emulsifier that breaks down fats. The jejunum is the middle portion of the small intestine. This is where a lot of absorption of nutrients takes place. I do want to note that your small intestine is incredibly long, and the reason for that is to increase the amount of time for absorption to take place. If you increase the amount of time, then you're going to absorb more nutrients. The ileum is the final portion of the small intestine where the large intestine or the colon and the small intestine meet. The large intestine is called the colon. The cecum is at the front of the colon. This is where probiotics and the appendix are found. The large intestine is primarily functioning in absorption of water to form feces, and it is the rectum where feces is stored prior to release through the anus. So the anus is the release location of the digestive system. There are a few accessory digestive structures as well, the liver being one of them. The liver detoxifies your blood. It also produces bile, which once again acts as an emulsifier to break down fats. It also functions in glucose storage. The gallbladder is in essence just a little blister on the surface of the liver where bile is stored, and then it releases that bile into the small intestine through the common bile duct. The pancreas regulates blood sugar with the production of insulin and glucagon, so it has an endocrine function, but it also produces pancreatic juices that aid in digestion in the intestine, the digestion of like proteins, for instance, that are released. These enzymes are released through what's called the pancreatic duct, and they're dumped into the duodenum. Alright, so we're moving on to the endocrine system, which is just a collection of glands that produce hormones. The endocrine system is very important in maintaining processes such as homeostasis. It also regulates metabolism, growth, and development. It's also involved in reproduction and circadian rhythm and the very important stress response. So we're going to begin with the endocrine glands that are at the base of the brain, the most superior of which being the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is incredibly important because it connects the endocrine system with the nervous system. And so what is happening is when your brain is stimulated by some environmental perturbation, for instance, it acts on the hypothalamus to secrete what are known as peptide-releasing hormones. Now these peptide-releasing hormones are not directly released into the bloodstream. Several of these releasing hormones act on the anterior pituitary, and there are cells in the anterior pituitary, that these releasing hormones from the hypothalamus are acting on, and it is these anterior pituitary hormones that are then released into the bloodstream. Now, two hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus travel into the posterior pituitary and then are released into the systemic circulation. These are antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, which promotes the retention of water in the kidneys and also is involved in increasing blood pressure. And there's also oxytocin, which regulates social interactions such as trust and pair bonding. And oxytocin has a big role in childbirth as well. These hypothalamic hormones travel through the posterior pituitary and then are released into systemic circulation. None of the hypothalamic hormones are directly released into the bloodstream. They have to travel to the pituitaries first. Alright, moving through the bodily tissues that those anterior pituitary hormones are then going to act on. First of which is the thyroid, which produces T3 and T4. These hormones control metabolism. There's also the parathyroid, which produces parathyroid hormone that regulates calcium levels. There's the thymus that produces thymosin, which is involved in the development of T cells. There's also the pineal gland that secretes melatonin, and a lot of you are probably familiar with melatonin. It is a hormone that a lot of people take as a sleep aid because it's very involved in regulating circadian rhythm. There's also the adrenal gland. This is where cortisol, or stress hormone, is released. There's also the release of aldosterone from the adrenal gland, and aldosterone is involved in salt and water balance. And there's also the release of angiotensin, which is involved in vasoconstriction, or the increase of blood pressure. Some other glands and hormones would be the pancreas, right? The pancreas is involved in glucose storage. It produces insulin, which is anabolic, and so that acts on glucose in the liver to store glucose in the form of glycogen. Glucagon acts on glycogen to break it down, so it's catabolic. It breaks glycogen down into glucose, and then glucose gets released into the bloodstream. The testes produce testosterone, which are very important in the development of male secondary sexual characteristics. Testosterone is very important for sperm development as well. It also has dihydrotestosterone being produced, which is also very important in male sexual characteristics. The ovary produces testosterone because it is testosterone that gets converted into estrogen. And just for a little fun fact tidbit, the male brain, right, these hormones such as testosterone and estrogen are being produced in the brain as well, right? They can act as neurotransmitters in the brain. And in the male brain, testosterone gets converted to estrogen, and it's actually estrogen that's responsible for masculinization of the male brain. So that's a fun little tidbit. In the ovary, that testosterone is going to get converted into estrogen, and estrogen plays a large role in menstruation, gestation, and birth, which is also known as parturition. It also produces progesterone that has a very large role in gestation because it tells your body not to ovulate again. And so when a female takes birth control, that birth control is generally made of estrogen and progesterone, and it's basically telling the body, I am pregnant, do not ovulate again. Moving on to the integumentary system, this comprises the skin. It's basically the body's first line of defense towards any danger or threat, such as pathogens, there's sunburn, things of that nature. It includes hair, feathers, hooves, scales, nails, and exocrine glands, like your sweat glands. The skin is the largest organ of the body. There are in essence 3 layers. There is the epidermis that is 90% composed of keratinocytes. And these keratinocytes produce keratin that stores, these keratinocytes store a protein called keratin that gives the epidermis a toughness. 8% of the epidermis is made of melanocytes, which is the pigment-producing cells, melanin, and melanin protects the skin from ultraviolet radiation. 1% of the epidermis is Langerhans cells, and these cells serve to detect pathogens. The second layer is the dermis, made of dense irregular connective tissue. This gives the skin strength and elasticity. It also contains nerve and blood cells. The hypodermis is made of loose connective tissue. It is flexible. It is that flexible connective tissue between the skin and the muscle or bone. And this area, the hypodermis, is also where adipose tissue or fat cells are stored. The lymphatic system is incredibly important with regards to immunity. It returns excess fluid from tissue to the blood, and it helps rid the body of toxins. It transports lymph, which contains white blood cells or leukocytes. There are several parts of your lymphatic system. The lymph nodes, that filters the lymph, and it also creates lymphocytes, which produce antibodies. Your tonsils are part of your lymphatic system. This is the first line of immune defense because it is sampling bacteria and viruses that are coming in through your mouth or your nose. There's also the adenoids that are located at the roof of your mouth behind your soft palate that produce antibodies. Your spleen is the largest lymphatic organ. The spleen is the location of the breakdown, storage, and production of red blood cells or erythrocytes. And of course, this helps fight infection. And then your thymus, right, which is also part of your endocrine system, produces thymosin, which is important in the development of T cells. So you'll notice that the lymphatic system is highly associated with, for instance, your circulatory system and your endocrine system. Another portion of the lymphatic system is red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is in essence just spongy tissue that generates other types of leukocytes. Bone marrow also generates erythrocytes and platelets. And this is because it contains mesenchymal and hematopoietic stem cells. And these hematopoietic stem cells can become red blood cells, white blood cells, or platelets. There are several types of leukocytes. There are your granulocytes, lymphocytes, monocytes, and macrophages. And then those platelets are your clotting mechanisms. Moving on to the muscular system, this is involved in movement of the body. Muscles attached to your bone, but they're also found inside the heart, your digestive organs, and blood vessels. There are several types of muscle tissue. There is skeletal muscle, which is attached to the bones. Skeletal muscle is striated and it's multinucleated. There's also cardiac muscle, which is the walls of the heart. Cardiac muscle is uninucleated, but it also has striations and what are called intercalated discs. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of hollow visceral organs other than the heart, such as your stomach. And these are also uninucleate, but they don't have striations or the intercalated discs. Just a quick thing about your muscular system, muscle contractions produce almost 70% of your body's heat, and muscle helps to stabilize joints. Alright, moving on to the nervous system. The nervous system is basically a complex of nerves and specialized cells that transmit signals between the brain and parts of the body. You have the central nervous system that is comprised of your brain and spinal cord, and your peripheral nervous system that's comprised of any sensory neurons and ganglia. There are two subdivisions of your peripheral nervous system. There's the somatic, which is voluntary, and so these are your muscles and sensory receptors in the skin. And there's also the autonomic peripheral nervous system that's involuntary, and this regulates bodily pressure such as blood pressure, also regulates the rate of breathing, and things of that nature. There are two cell types in the nervous system, one of which being neurons. Neurons transmit nerve impulses. There are three parts to a neuron. There's the dendrite, and this is the input to the neuron. The dendrite basically receives chemical messages from the presynaptic neuron. Axons transmit an electrical message to the axon terminal. At the axon terminals, that's where the synaptic cleft is located, and that is basically the connection between the pre- and postsynaptic neuron, right? And if you think about it, the presynaptic neuron is right above the synaptic cleft, and post is below the synaptic cleft, excuse me. So the electrical signal gets converted into neurotransmitters or a chemical signal at the axon terminals, and then those neurotransmitters are released across the synaptic cleft. There are also glial cells. There are several types. There are about 6 types of glial cells, but here we only cover 4. There are microglia. These clean up cellular debris. Astrocytes support and repair neurons, and they also form the blood-brain barrier. And that blood-brain barrier is incredibly important because it keeps pathogens out of your brain. And if something got into your brain, some foreign object that should not be there, it can be catastrophic. Which is why neti pots, if you don't heat up the water before you use a neti pot, there is an amoeba, a brain-eating amoeba, and if something goes up your nose, it bypasses the blood-brain barrier. And so if you use a neti pot without heating up and just boiling that water, and that amoeba is in that water, that amoeba bypasses the blood-brain barrier and enters your brain, and if that happens, the person can die within 24 hours. There are also oligodendrocytes, these myelinate axons in the central nervous system. Myelinated axons just transmit a signal very quickly. Schwann cells myelinate axons in the peripheral nervous system. Next, we're moving on to the respiratory system. The respiratory system is very important in gas exchange. That's the take-up of oxygen and release of carbon dioxide. Red blood cells collect oxygen in the lung and transport that oxygen to bodily tissues, and then it transports carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of cellular respiration, back to the lung to be released or exhaled from the body. So during inhalation, there's this epiglottis close to your esophagus. So when you eat something, right, and your epiglottis doesn't close or cover your trachea in time, if you're, well, drinking something, I guess, imagine if water gets down in your trachea and you start coughing and you're like, it went through the wrong hole. That's because your epiglottis didn't close in time. So that epiglottis is controlling what goes through your trachea. And when you inhale, the epiglottis opens. Now the trachea branches into left and right bronchi, and these bronchi are aligned with pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And in that epithelium are goblet cells that produce mucus. Now the bronchi branch into what are called bronchioles, and these bronchioles subsequently branch into smaller bronchioles called respiratory bronchioles. Now at the end of these respiratory bronchioles are alveolar ducts and the alveolar sac and the alveoli. And so these alveoli contain smooth muscle and connective tissue, and they're surrounded by blood vessels. And it is at these blood vessels surrounding these alveoli that gas exchange takes place. Alright, moving on to the skeletal system, we're almost done. The skeletal system consists of 206 bones, also consists of tendons, ligaments, and cartilage. The skeletal system is incredibly important because it functions in support movement, protection, blood cell production, calcium storage, and even has a role in endocrine regulation. Okay, so we'll just go through parts of the skeletal system. Bone is the tough, rigid form of connective tissue. It's highly mineralized with calcium salts, and it is produced by what are known as osteocytes. Now, some of you might be a little confused as to the difference of an osteoblast and an osteocyte. Well, an osteoblast, when it gets trapped in a matrix, like the lacuna of the compact bone, it becomes an osteocyte. And an osteocyte basically has these long cytoplasmic extensions that occupy caniculi, and this is where the exchange of nutrients and waste occurs through gap junctions in your bone. Now, cartilage, compared to bone, is still connective tissue, but it's non-rigid and it's not highly mineralized with calcium. It is produced by what are called chondrocytes, and chondrocytes arise from chondroblasts. Joints are very important in the skeletal system because they allow rigidity and movement of your skeletal system. Now, there are two types of skeletal system. There's your axial skeleton, which consists of the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. And your appendicular skeleton are the appendages, so your pectoral or shoulder and pelvic girdle. It also consists of the humerus, ulna, radius, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Those are your upper limb bones. Your lower limb bones are the femur, the tibia, the fibula, the tarsals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges. Alright, so what I've done here for the last system is I've combined the urinary system and the reproductive systems. And this is done pretty often. It's called the urogenital system. And the reason why we combine the urinary and reproductive systems is because they share a lot of the same ducts when it comes to releasing objects from the body. The urinary system consists of the kidney, ureter, urinary bladder, and the urethra. The male reproductive system consists of the testes and the penis and any accessory organs like the prostate gland. The female reproductive system consists of the ovary, the fallopian tube, and the uterus, and any accessory organs as well. So here we're just going to go through a quick rundown of the urinary system. So in the kidney is the production of urine. It's released, that urine is released into the renal pelvis, and then it goes through the ureter, and the ureter is just a duct that the urine travels from the kidney to the urinary bladder. The urine is then stored in the urinary bladder, and then once it comes time, that urine is expelled through the urethra. So for the female reproductive system, the ovary, right, is the female gonad. It's the location of oogenesis, or egg production. Females make all the eggs they're ever going to produce in utero, or prior to development. These eggs get suspended in prophase 1 of meiosis until the females hit puberty. And then, once the female hits puberty, females begin to ovulate. And ovulation is just the release of a mature egg from the ovary, where it gets uptaken into the fallopian tube. And the fallopian tube is where fertilization takes place. The uterus is where implantation and development of the embryo takes place. It's important to note that if there was no fertilization of the egg, there's this epithelial lining of the uterus, right? If there is a fertilized egg, you want that uterus, the epithelial lining, to be nice and snug. But if there is no fertilized embryo, that epithelial lining is shed in what's called menstruation. The male reproductive system consists of the testes, which is the location of spermatogenesis, or sperm production. There's also the epididymis, which is the location of sperm storage, where the sperm mature. The vas deferens is the duct that sperm travels from the epididymis to the urethra. And the penis is where the urethra, right, is going to expel both urinary and reproductive products from the body. Alright, and that is everything for the different organ systems. Just a quick overview. If you want a more detailed overview, look at some of the other videos.